A routine night gone wrong. The streets of Ashtonville were calm that evening, the orange hues of the setting sun casting long shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Julian Carter, a 49-year-old man with salt and pepper hair and a steadfast demeanor, was on his way home. His day had been long but fulfilling, filled with meetings with local leaders to discuss ways to strengthen community ties. A modest black sedan, Julian's car blended into the quiet streets. He looked forward to his wife's home-cooked lasagna and an evening of unwinding with his family. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, the soft hum of his engine filled the car. The speedometer needle hovered at a steady 32 miles per hour in the 35 miles per hour zone. Lost in thoughts about the day's discussions, he almost didn't notice the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. The shrill wail of the police siren cut through the silence, making his heart sink. Julian's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced around. No traffic violations, no broken lights, and he was well within the speed limit. Yet here he was, being pulled over. "Stay calm," Julian muttered under his breath, his years of experience as a law enforcement officer reminding him to follow protocol. He signaled, carefully pulled to the side of the road, and turned off his car. His hands remained visible on the wheel as he waited. Two officers emerged from the patrol car. One, tall and lean with a hardened expression, approached Julian's window, while the other, shorter and stockier, lingered near the rear of Julian's car, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. The taller officer rapped on the window with his flashlight. "License and registration," he barked without preamble, his tone curt and dismissive. Julian slowly lowered his window, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Of course, officer. My license is in my wallet, and my registration is in the glove compartment. May I retrieve them?" The officer gave a sharp nod, but didn't relax. Julian moved deliberately, narrating each motion. "I'm opening the glove compartment now." He handed over the requested documents. The officer scrutinized Julian's license, his eyes narrowing. "You in a hurry tonight?" "No, sir," Julian replied evenly. "I'm just heading home." The officer ignored his answer, shining his flashlight around the car's interior. "You were swerving back there," he stated flatly. Julian frowned slightly. "With respect, officer, I wasn't swerving. My dash cam can confirm that." The officer's expression darkened. "Dash cam, huh? We'll see about that. Step out of the vehicle." Julian's stomach sank, but his face remained composed. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. Is this necessary?" The officer's jaw clenched. "I said, step out of the vehicle. Now." Julian unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements deliberate. As he opened the door and stood, the stockier officer moved in, grabbing his arm with unnecessary force. "Resisting, huh?" he sneered, twisting Julian's arm behind his back. Julian winced as cold metal cuffs bit into his wrists. "I'm not resisting," he said firmly, his voice calm but resolute. "This is unnecessary." The officers exchanged smirks, ignoring him as they shoved him into the back seat of their squad car. From behind the glass, Julian could see a few neighbors peeking out from behind curtains, their silhouettes illuminated by porch lights. None of them stepped outside. As the squad car pulled away, Julian's mind raced. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered profiling, but it was the first time it had gone this far. What the officers didn't realize, however, was that their actions were about to backfire spectacularly. In the front seat, the officers seemed at ease, laughing and chatting as though they hadn't just unlawfully detained a man. The taller officer glanced back at Julian through the rearview mirror. "So, what's the story? Late-night joyride? Or something else you don't want us to know?" Julian met his gaze steadily. "I'm just a man trying to get home." The stockier officer snorted. "Yeah, we hear that all the time." Julian bit his tongue. He knew any retort would only escalate the situation. Instead, he focused on remaining calm, already planning his next steps. When they arrived at the precinct, Julian was led into a holding cell. The metallic clang of the door echoed ominously as it shut behind him. He sat on the cold bench, his expression unreadable, as the officer stood just outside, reviewing his documents. "Everything checks out," the taller officer said, almost disappointed. The stockier one shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Guys like him always have skeletons. We'll dig something up." Julian overheard their conversation, but kept his composure. His patience, he knew, would pay off. Hours passed. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, and the precinct buzzed with activity. Other officers occasionally glanced at Julian, curiosity flickering in their eyes, but none seemed to recognize him. That would change soon enough. Finally, as dawn broke, a woman in her mid-40s with a commanding presence strode into the precinct. Her badge read Lieutenant Harper, and her expression was a mix of professionalism and irritation. She stopped in front of Julian's cell, glancing at the paperwork in her hand. "What's going on here?" she asked sharply, turning to the arresting officers. The taller officer, Daniels, stepped forward. "We picked him up for reckless driving and resisting arrest." Harper arched an eyebrow. "Reckless driving? Where's the evidence?" "We're still processing it," the stockier officer, Reed, replied, his casual tone doing little to mask his unease. Harper's frown deepened as she turned to Julian. "Sir, do you have any idea why you were stopped?" Julian met her gaze calmly. "I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny. I also have a dash cam that will confirm my account." Harper's eyes narrowed as she glanced back at the officers. "You didn't review his dash cam?" Daniels shrugged. "We didn't get to it yet." Harper exhaled sharply. "Get it now. And both of you, my office. Now." As the officers slunk away, Julian allowed himself a small smile. The tide was turning. But this was just the beginning of the reckoning that was about to unfold. Truth revealed in the light of day. Julian sat silently in the holding cell, the cold metal bench pressing uncomfortably against his back. The night had dragged on endlessly, with no clarity on how long he'd remain detained. He was calm but alert, his mind a maelstrom of thoughts and strategies. He didn't have the luxury of giving in to frustration or fear. Every second spent in that cell was a test of his resolve, but Julian was no stranger to adversity. The precinct buzzed with early morning activity as officers clocked in for their shifts. Some glanced curiously at Julian as they passed the holding area. He could see the confusion in their eyes, their unspoken questions. Who is this man? Why does he look so composed? But none of them stopped to ask. From the other side of the precinct, Lieutenant Harper was in her office, her expression dark, as she reviewed the situation. She watched the dash cam footage Daniels and Reed had finally provided. Her jaw clenched as she saw Julian's calm compliance contrasted with the officer's aggressive behavior. The video left no room for interpretation. It was a blatant abuse of power. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, slamming the tablet onto her desk. Harper had been on the force for over 2 decades. She prided herself on running a tight ship, and this kind of conduct was exactly what she had vowed to eradicate. Yet here it was, happening under her nose. She stood abruptly and marched toward the holding cells, her boots echoing sharply against the tile floor. Harper wasn't the type to let things slide, and she wasn't about to start now. Julian looked up as Harper approached his cell. Her gaze was sharp, but there was no hostility in it, only a controlled intensity. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone firm but respectful. "I've reviewed the footage. This shouldn't have happened. You're being released immediately." Julian nodded, rising from the bench with the grace of a man who had been waiting for this moment. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate your promptness in addressing this." Harper motioned for an officer to unlock the cell door. As the metal bars slid open, she gestured toward her office. "I'd like to speak with you privately before you leave, if you don't mind." Julian followed her, his posture upright and steady. As they entered Harper's office, she closed the door behind them and gestured for him to sit. The room was Spartan, with a neat desk, a few chairs, and a bulletin board covered in case files. Harper sat across from him, her expression a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Before we proceed," she began, folding her hands on the desk, "I need to ask, who are you? You don't seem like a typical civilian caught up in something like this." Julian smiled faintly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Let's just say I have experience with situations like this. Staying composed is something I've learned over the years." Harper studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. But I suspect there's more to this story, and I intend to find out." Julian didn't respond. He wasn't ready to reveal his full identity. Not yet. There was a lesson to be learned here, and it wasn't just for the officers who had wronged him. It was for the entire department. Meanwhile, in another part of the precinct, Daniels and Reed sat nervously in Harper's office. The tension was palpable as Harper strode in, her expression as cold and sharp as a blade. "Care to explain what happened last night?" she demanded, placing her hands firmly on the desk. Daniels shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We saw him driving erratically, swerving into another lane. It looked suspicious, so we pulled him over." "And the dash cam footage," Harper snapped. "It clearly shows him driving within the speed limit, staying in his lane, and complying with every instruction you gave him. Care to explain that?" Reed leaned back in his chair, attempting a nonchalant shrug. "Maybe the dash cam missed something. We were just doing our job." Harper's eyes narrowed. "Your job doesn't include fabricating violations or escalating situations without cause, and it certainly doesn't include detaining someone simply because you think they're an easy target." Daniels paled, while Reed's smug expression faltered. They knew they were in deep trouble, but neither seemed willing to admit fault. "This isn't over," Harper said coldly. "You're both suspended pending an internal investigation. Turn in your badges and weapons before you leave the building." The two officers exchanged stunned glances, but Harper didn't give them a chance to argue. "Now," she barked, her tone brooking no dissent. Back in Harper's office, Julian leaned back slightly in his chair, watching as the lieutenant processed the situation. He could see the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the quiet resolve to set things right. "I need to thank you," Harper said finally, breaking the silence, "for staying calm, for not escalating the situation yourself. It speaks to your character." Julian inclined his head slightly. "Thank you, Lieutenant, but this isn't just about me. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to persist. If it happened to me, it's happening to others." Harper nodded, her expression grim. "I know, and I intend to address it. This department needs to do better." Julian stood, extending a hand. "If there's anything I can do to assist, don't hesitate to reach out." Harper shook his hand firmly. "I'll keep that in mind. And thank you for your patience. I hope this doesn't tarnish your view of our department entirely." Julian offered a small, enigmatic smile. "I'll reserve judgment for now." As he left the precinct, the sun was fully up, casting a golden glow over the city. Julian didn't head home. Instead, he drove to the police headquarters downtown, where his reserved parking spot awaited him. Julian stepped into the grand lobby of the headquarters, the familiar sounds of ringing phones and hurried footsteps surrounding him. His assistant, a sharp and efficient woman named Claire, looked up from her desk, her eyes widening in surprise. "Chief Carter," she said, standing quickly. "You're here early." Julian nodded. "It's been an eventful night, Claire. I need you to prepare the briefing room. I'll be addressing the department this afternoon." Claire hesitated, sensing the gravity of his tone. "Of course, Chief. Right away." As Julian entered his office and closed the door behind him, he exhaled deeply. He knew that today's address would set the tone for his tenure as police chief. The events of the previous night weren't just a personal affront. They were a glaring example of the systemic issues he had been brought in to reform. Sitting at his desk, Julian began drafting his speech. He chose his words carefully, knowing that they would be scrutinized by his officers, the community, and the media. This wasn't just about accountability. It was about rebuilding trust. And that, Julian knew, was a task that required both courage and persistence. The day ahead would be challenging, but Julian was ready. He had faced worse and emerged stronger. Today would be no different. The storm was far from over, but Julian was determined to weather it and emerge on the other side, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of the change the city desperately needed. A reckoning within the ranks. Julian Carter leaned against his office window, gazing out at the city he had vowed to serve and protect. The skyline shimmered under the morning sun, but his mind was clouded with the events of the night before. He had just experienced a sharp reminder of why he had taken the position of police chief in the first place. The two officers who had profiled and unlawfully detained him were not anomalies. They were symptoms of a deeper problem, and Julian intended to root it out. His assistant, Claire, knocked softly on the door, breaking his thoughts. "Chief Carter, the briefing room is ready. The officers are gathering." Julian turned, his face calm but resolute. "Thank you, Claire. Let's get started." The walk to the briefing room was silent but purposeful. Julian's polished shoes echoed against the marble floors of the headquarters. By the time he entered, the room was filled with dozens of officers, their faces a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and in some cases, defiance. Word had spread quickly about the incident, but the full details were still under wraps. Today, Julian planned to change that. He stepped to the podium, his tall frame commanding attention. Clearing his throat, he began, his deep voice carrying weight. "Good morning, everyone. Before we get into today's agenda, there's an incident we need to address." The murmurs in the room stilled. Julian's gaze swept across the crowd, ensuring he had everyone's attention. "Last night, I was pulled over and detained by two of our own officers, Daniels and Reed. The reason given was reckless driving, a charge that the dash cam footage from my vehicle has already disproven." The room erupted into a mix of shocked gasps and muttered conversations. Julian raised a hand, calling for silence. This incident wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was an abuse of power, fueled by assumptions and bias. I experienced firsthand the very behavior we're supposed to be eradicating in this department. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Some of you might be wondering why I didn't identify myself as your chief immediately. I didn't because I wanted to see how the situation would unfold without bias or influence. What I saw was a failure, not just on the part of the officers involved, but on all of us for allowing a culture like this to persist." The room was eerily silent now, the gravity of Julian's statement sinking in. Some officers avoided his gaze, while others sat up straighter, their expressions a mix of guilt and resolve. "Let me be clear," Julian continued. "This isn't about singling out individuals. It's about addressing a systemic issue. Effective immediately, we will implement new measures to ensure this kind of behavior is not tolerated. These changes won't be easy, but they are necessary." He outlined the reforms: mandatory bias and de-escalation training, the installation of body cams for all patrol officers, and an anonymous internal reporting system to encourage accountability. The measures were met with a mixture of nods and murmurs, but Julian wasn't finished. "I also want to say this. If you're unwilling to embrace these changes, if you cannot uphold the principles of fairness and integrity, then this department is not the place for you. The badge you wear is a symbol of service, not a license to abuse power." The room fell silent again. Julian's words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to defy them. After a moment, one officer stood, a veteran sergeant with decades of service under his belt. "Chief Carter," he said, his voice steady, "I've been in this department for over 30 years. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I have to admit, what you're saying is long overdue. You have my support." Others in the room began nodding, the ripple of agreement growing louder. But Julian also noticed a few skeptical faces, officers who exchanged glances or crossed their arms in defiance. He made a mental note of them. Change, he knew, wouldn't come without resistance. "Thank you, Sergeant," Julian said, his voice firm. "This is only the beginning. Together, we can rebuild this department into one we can all be proud of." After the meeting, Julian returned to his office, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. Resistance from within the ranks was inevitable, and public scrutiny would be relentless. But he also knew that change was never easy. Claire entered, carrying a stack of files. "Chief, Lieutenant Harper is here to see you." "Send her in," Julian said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Harper entered, her face composed but serious. She carried a folder under her arm, which she placed on Julian's desk as she sat down. "Chief," she began, "I've completed the preliminary investigation into Officers Daniels and Reed. Their conduct was in clear violation of department policy. I recommend immediate suspension without pay, pending further disciplinary action." Julian opened the folder, skimming the report. Harper's thoroughness was evident. She had included transcripts of the dash cam footage, statements from other officers, and her own observations. "Good work, Lieutenant," Julian said, closing the folder. "What's your assessment of the broader culture in the precinct?" Harper hesitated, then spoke carefully. "To be honest, Chief, there's a lot of work to be done. There are good officers here, but there's also a tolerance for bad behavior that's gone unchecked for years. It's going to take more than new policies to fix that." Julian nodded. "Agreed. Culture doesn't change overnight, but it starts with accountability." Harper leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. "If you need someone to lead the charge on these reforms, Chief, I'm ready. I believe in what you're trying to do." Julian met her gaze, seeing the determination in her eyes. "Thank you, Lieutenant. I'll be relying on you." That evening, Julian attended a community town hall, an event he had scheduled weeks ago, but which now carried new significance. The community was already buzzing with rumors about the previous night's incident, and Julian knew he needed to address it head-on. The room was packed with residents, local leaders, and media representatives. As Julian took the stage, the chatter died down, all eyes fixed on him. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "I'm here tonight to talk about the future of our community and the role our police department plays in it. But first, I want to share something personal." He recounted the events of the previous night, detailing the unlawful stop and his detention. Gasps rippled through the audience, followed by murmurs of disbelief and anger. "What happened to me was not an isolated incident," Julian said. "It's a reflection of a system that needs to change, a system that I am now responsible for reforming." He spoke about the measures he was implementing and his commitment to accountability. By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause, though some skepticism lingered in the eyes of a few audience members. As Julian stepped down from the stage, a young man approached him, his expression a mixture of admiration and frustration. "Chief Carter," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "what you went through, it could have been me. It could have been any of us." Julian placed a hand on the man's shoulder, his gaze steady. "You're right, and that's why we're going to fix this, together." The young man nodded, his eyes shining with a newfound hope. It was a small moment, but for Julian, it was a reminder of why he had taken this fight on. Change wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. And Julian Carter was ready to lead the charge. The weight of leadership. The glow of the early morning sun filtered through the large windows of Julian Carter's office. The city outside was waking up, but inside the police headquarters, the atmosphere was tense and quiet. Julian sat at his desk, his hands clasped together as he stared at the report Lieutenant Harper had submitted the night before. The investigation into Officers Daniels and Reed was damning. Their history of complaints, allegations of excessive force, racial bias, and procedural violations painted a grim picture. The fact that they had remained on the force for so long spoke volumes about the cracks in the system. Julian sighed deeply, his gaze hardening. There was a knock at the door, and Claire entered with her usual efficiency. "Chief, the mayor's office is on the line. They want an update on the incident." Julian nodded, gesturing for her to patch the call through. A moment later, the stern voice of Mayor Evelyn Grant filled the room. "Chief Carter," she began, skipping pleasantries, "I've been following the developments from last night. The community is outraged, and frankly, so am I. What are you doing to address this?" Julian leaned back in his chair, his tone calm but firm. "Madam Mayor, I've already suspended the officers involved and initiated an internal investigation. Reforms are being rolled out immediately, including mandatory training and oversight measures. This isn't just about discipline. It's about rebuilding trust." "That's all well and good, Chief," Grant replied, her voice tinged with impatience. "But we need results. The city is on edge, and if we don't act decisively, we risk losing what little faith the public has left in us." Julian's jaw tightened. He understood the urgency, but he also knew that rushing the process could lead to mistakes. "Madam Mayor, I assure you that this situation is being handled with the seriousness it deserves. Transparency will be key, and I intend to address the public directly later today." There was a pause on the other end before the mayor spoke again, her tone slightly softened. "Make sure you do. The people are watching, Chief. And so am I." The line went dead, and Julian set the phone down, exhaling slowly. He had faced pressure before, but this was different. The weight of the entire city's expectations now rested squarely on his shoulders. That afternoon, Julian stood on the steps of the police headquarters, facing a sea of reporters and cameras. The press conference had drawn a large crowd, including community leaders, activists, and concerned citizens. Julian adjusted the microphone, his expression resolute as he began to speak. "Good afternoon. I want to start by acknowledging the events of the past 24 hours. Last night, I was unlawfully detained by 2 officers from this department. The incident was a clear example of the kind of behavior that has eroded trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve." The crowd murmured, a mixture of outrage and anticipation rippling through the audience. "This is not acceptable," Julian continued. "Not for me, not for anyone. As chief of police, I hold myself and my department to the highest standards of accountability. That is why I have taken immediate action to address this incident." He outlined the steps he had already taken, including the suspension of Daniels and Reed and the implementation of new reforms. His voice was steady but carried a weight of emotion as he spoke about the need for systemic change. "We cannot change the past," Julian said, looking directly into the cameras, "but we can and will change the future. This department will no longer tolerate misconduct or bias of any kind. Every officer will be held accountable, starting with me." The crowd erupted into applause, though some skeptics in the audience remained silent, their expressions guarded. Julian understood their hesitation. Words alone wouldn't be enough. He had to prove his commitment through action. Later that evening, Julian met with a group of community leaders in a local recreation center. The room was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds, their faces a mix of hope and skepticism. Julian stood at the front, flanked by Lieutenant Harper and a few other senior officers who had pledged their support for the reforms. "Thank you all for coming," Julian began, his tone earnest. "I know many of you have questions and concerns, and I'm here to listen. But first, I want to share my vision for this department." He spoke about his commitment to transparency and accountability, about the new measures being put in place, and about his personal experience the night before. His words were met with nods of agreement, but also with pointed questions. A young woman in the crowd raised her hand. "Chief Carter, how can we trust you to fix this when the problems have been going on for so long? What makes you different?" Julian met her gaze, his expression sincere. "I understand your skepticism, and I don't blame you. Trust has to be earned, not demanded. What makes me different is my commitment to seeing this through, no matter how difficult it gets. I can't promise overnight change, but I can promise that I will not stop until this department becomes one that serves and protects every member of this community equally. Another hand shot up, this time an older man with a weathered face. What about the officers who don't want change? Are you going to protect them, or will you hold them accountable too? Julian's voice hardened slightly. Let me be clear. Any officer who cannot uphold the values of integrity, fairness, and respect has no place in this department. Accountability applies to everyone, including myself. The room erupted into applause, and Julian felt a surge of hope. The road ahead would be long, but moments like this reminded him why the fight was worth it. As the meeting concluded, Julian lingered to speak with attendees individually. A middle-aged woman approached him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Chief Carter," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. My son had a run-in with the police a few months ago, and it didn't end well. Hearing you speak tonight gives me hope that things can change." Julian placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Thank you for sharing that with me. I promise to do everything in my power to make sure no one else has to go through what your family did." She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her tears. It was moments like these that fueled Julian's resolve. The fight for justice wasn't just about policies and procedures. It was about people, about lives, and about the community he had sworn to protect. Late that night, back in his office, Julian sat at his desk, reviewing the next steps in his reform plan. The precinct was quiet, the only sounds the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of papers from Claire's desk outside. As he worked, a knock at the door startled him. Lieutenant Harper stepped in, her expression serious. "Chief, I've just received a tip," she said. "Daniels and Reed are planning to contest their suspensions. They're claiming the dash cam footage was doctored." Julian set his pen down, his expression unflinching. "Let them. The truth is on our side." Harper nodded, but her eyes betrayed a hint of concern. "This isn't just about their jobs, Chief. They're trying to undermine your authority. If they succeed, it could derail everything you're trying to accomplish." Julian leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Then we'll fight back. Not with lies or intimidation, but with the truth. This department belongs to the people, not to officers who abuse their power. And I won't let anyone take that away." Harper's lips quirked into a small smile. "You're a stubborn man, Chief." Julian chuckled softly. "It's been said before, but stubbornness is what this fight needs." As Harper left, Julian turned back to his work, a renewed sense of determination coursing through him. The battle was far from over, but Julian Carter wasn't one to back down. He had faced injustice and emerged stronger. Now he was determined to ensure that no one else would have to endure what he had. And so the fight continued, not just for justice, but for the soul of the department and the city it served. The unseen war. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city of Ashtonville. Julian Carter sat at his desk in the police headquarters, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. The day had been grueling, filled with meetings, press inquiries, and internal pushback. The battle to reform the department was in full swing, and the weight of it pressed heavily on his shoulders. On his desk lay a stack of documents: complaints against officers Daniels and Reed, reports from the internal investigation, and proposals for the new training programs. Each paper represented a story, a failure of the system, and a reason for Julian's fight. Yet tonight, as the precinct emptied out and the building grew quiet, Julian felt the solitude of leadership more acutely than ever. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He looked up to see Lieutenant Harper, her expression serious as she stepped inside. "Chief, you need to see this," she said, placing a tablet on his desk. Julian picked it up and pressed play. The video was grainy, recorded from a body cam, but the audio was clear. It was a conversation between Daniels and Reed, recorded the night of Julian's unlawful detention. We'll spin it however we need to, Reed's voice said, casual and cocky. It's not like anyone's going to believe him over us. Daniels chuckled nervously. I don't know, man. He was way too calm. What if he's someone important? Doesn't matter, Reed replied dismissively. We'll just bury it. Who's going to stop us? Julian's jaw tightened as he listened. The arrogance, the casual disregard for accountability. It was exactly what he was fighting to eradicate. He set the tablet down, his mind racing. Where did this come from? He asked Harper. One of the junior officers found it while reviewing body cam footage for the investigation, she replied. It's damning, Chief. This could be the final nail in their careers. Julian leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. It's more than that, Lieutenant. This isn't just about Daniels and Reed. This is about the culture that allowed them to operate like this in the first place. If we're going to use this, we need to make it count. Harper nodded. What's the plan? Julian's mind worked quickly, forming a strategy. First, ensure this footage is secured and cannot be tampered with. Then we'll present it to the Internal Review Board and the City Council. But before that, I want the public to see it. Transparency is the only way to rebuild trust. Harper hesitated. You're sure about that? The department's reputation will take a hit. It's already in shambles, Julian said firmly. Hiding the truth won't fix that. Only honesty and accountability will. The next day, Julian called an emergency press conference. The precinct's parking lot was packed with reporters, community leaders, and residents, all eager to hear what the chief had to say. Tension buzzed in the air as Julian stepped up to the podium. Good afternoon, he began, his voice steady and commanding. Today, I'm here to share the results of an ongoing internal investigation into the actions of Officers Daniels and Reed. What you are about to see is difficult, but it's the truth. And the truth is what this department owes to the people it serves. He gestured to a large screen behind him, where the body cam footage began to play. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the recording revealed the officers' blatant disregard for protocol and their mockery of accountability. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience, followed by a simmering anger. When the video ended, Julian returned to the podium. This behavior is unacceptable. It is a betrayal of the trust placed in us by the community. Officers Daniels and Reed have been suspended and will face disciplinary action. But this is not just about two individuals. It is about a system that has allowed such behavior to go unchecked. He took a deep breath before continuing. That system ends now. This department will no longer tolerate misconduct, bias, or abuse of power. We are implementing new policies, including mandatory body cam reviews, community oversight panels, and rigorous training programs. These changes will be difficult, but they are necessary. The crowd erupted into applause, though Julian could still see skepticism in some faces. He understood their doubt. Trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight, but this was a step in the right direction. Inside the precinct, the mood was tense. While some officers supported Julian's reforms, others viewed them as an attack on their authority. Rumors swirled about a group of officers who were quietly working against him, trying to undermine his efforts. Julian was aware of the resistance. That evening, he called a meeting with his senior staff, including Harper and a few trusted officers. As they gathered in the conference room, Julian addressed the elephant in the room. I know there are those among us who are resistant to change, he began, his tone firm. Let me be clear. This department will move forward, with or without their cooperation. If anyone has concerns or grievances, now is the time to speak. The room was silent for a moment before one officer, Captain Ramirez, spoke up. Chief, I've been with this department for 20 years. I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some bad. But this, what you're doing, it's necessary. And you have my full support. Others nodded in agreement, but Julian noticed a few officers exchanging glances, their expressions guarded. He knew that not everyone in the room was on board, but he also knew that leadership meant forging ahead, even in the face of resistance. As the days turned into weeks, the reforms began to take shape. Training sessions were held, body cams were distributed, and community leaders were invited to participate in oversight panels. The changes weren't without their challenges. Some officers grumbled about the increased scrutiny, while others openly resisted. Julian worked tirelessly, meeting with officers individually to address their concerns and holding town halls to keep the community informed. He knew that change required persistence and patience, but the strain of it all was beginning to take its toll. One evening, as Julian sat alone in his office, reviewing yet another stack of reports, Claire knocked softly on the door. "Chief," she said, her voice gentle. "You've been here all day. You need to rest." Julian looked up, exhaustion evident in his eyes. "There's too much to do, Claire. I can't afford to slow down." She stepped closer, her expression kind but firm. "You won't be able to leave this department if you burn yourself out. Take a break, even if it's just for a few hours." Julian hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. Thank you, Claire." As he left the precinct that night, the city seemed quieter, calmer. For the first time in weeks, Julian allowed himself a moment of reflection. The fight was far from over, but progress was being made. And as long as there was progress, there was hope. Julian Carter knew that leadership wasn't about being perfect, it was about persevering, even when the path was difficult. And he was determined to see this fight through to the end. A legacy forged in fire. Julian Carter stood in the shadow of Ashtonville City Hall, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the large crowd gathered on the steps. The past few months had been a whirlwind of challenges, resistance, and triumphs, but today marked a significant milestone: the public unveiling of the Ashtonville Police Department's new Community Accountability Program. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Community leaders, activists, residents, and media outlets had all gathered to hear the announcement. For Julian, this moment was the culmination of tireless efforts to rebuild trust and transform a broken system. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and stepped up to the podium. The crowd hushed as his deep voice carried over the microphones. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his tone steady but resolute. "Today is not about me. It's not even about the Ashtonville Police Department. Today is about all of us, about what we can achieve when we refuse to accept the status quo, when we come together to demand better." He paused, letting the words sink in. As many of you know, this journey began with a single unacceptable incident. But what I experienced that night was not unique. It was a symptom of a larger issue, one that has affected countless members of this community. And I made a promise to myself, and to all of you, that we would not let it stand. Julian gestured to a large screen behind him, where a presentation began to play. It outlined the new measures being implemented: community oversight panels with real authority, mandatory body cam usage and regular audits, de-escalation training designed with input from residents, and a zero-tolerance policy for misconduct. "These changes are just the beginning," Julian continued. "They are the foundation of a department that will no longer act as an enforcer, but as a partner to the people it serves." The crowd erupted into applause, and Julian allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. But as the noise died down, he raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "I know that trust isn't rebuilt with speeches or policies alone. It's rebuilt through action, through consistency. And I promise you this: as long as I am chief of police, this department will act with integrity, accountability, and respect. We will hold ourselves to the highest standards, because that is what you deserve." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Julian's mind was already on the next steps. The unveiling of the program was a victory, but he knew the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. Later that day, Julian returned to his office at the precinct. The building felt different now, lighter, more hopeful. The changes he had implemented were starting to take root. Officers who resisted the reforms had either left or were undergoing rigorous retraining. Those who stayed were beginning to embrace the new culture. Lieutenant Harper entered the office, carrying a folder. "Chief, the final internal report on Daniels and Reed is ready." Julian gestured for her to sit, and she handed him the folder. He opened it, skimming the contents. The evidence was overwhelming. Falsified reports, a pattern of racially biased stops, and a trail of complaints that had been ignored for years. "They've been terminated," Harper said. "And the district attorney is moving forward with charges for misconduct and abuse of power." Julian nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. It's about time." Harper hesitated before speaking again. "You've set a precedent, Chief. What happened to Daniels and Reed is sending a message, not just to this department, but to the entire city." Julian looked up, his gaze steady. "It's a message we need to send. Accountability isn't optional. It's the foundation of trust." In the weeks that followed, Julian's reforms began to show results. Complaints against officers dropped significantly, and the community oversight panels became a trusted resource for residents. Public confidence in the department slowly began to rebuild, though Julian knew there was still much work to be done. One evening, Julian attended a town hall meeting. The recreation center was packed, the energy in the room electric. Residents lined up to ask questions and share their concerns, but the tone was different now, more hopeful, less adversarial. A young man in his early 20s stepped up to the microphone. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Chief Carter, I want to thank you. My brother had an encounter with the police last year, and it didn't go well. But last week, I was pulled over, and it was completely different. The officer treated me with respect. He even apologized for the inconvenience. That's never happened before." The room erupted into applause, and Julian felt a swell of pride. Moments like this reminded him why he had taken this fight on. After the meeting, an older woman approached him. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and filled with determination. "Chief Carter," she said, her voice steady, "you've done more for this community in a few months than some people have done in a lifetime. Don't let anyone stop you." Julian smiled, his resolve strengthened. "Thank you. I won't." As the months turned into a year, Julian's efforts began to attract attention far beyond Ashtonville. Other cities reached out, asking for guidance on implementing similar reforms. Julian was invited to speak at national conferences, sharing his experiences and lessons learned. But despite the accolades and recognition, Julian remained focused on his mission. He spent his days working side by side with his officers, ensuring the changes he had implemented were more than just words on paper. One evening, as Julian prepared to leave the precinct, Harper stopped him in the hallway. "Chief," she said, her tone serious but warm, "you've done something incredible here. The department is unrecognizable from where it was a year ago. You've built something that will last." Julian looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about me, Harper. It's about the people, the officers who believed in change, the residents who demanded it, and the community that refused to give up. I just helped push things in the right direction." Harper smiled. "Well, you've pushed pretty hard." As Julian walked out into the cool night air, he looked up at the city skyline. The fight for justice was far from over, but Ashtonville was on a new path, one built on accountability, trust, and hope. And for Julian Carter, that was a legacy worth fighting for. A legacy fulfilled. The crisp night air filled Julian Carter's lungs as he stepped outside the precinct, the city lights casting a soft glow on the quiet streets. Ashtonville had begun to feel different, not just to him, but to everyone who called it home. The changes were slow, sometimes imperceptible, but they were there. Fewer complaints, more respectful interactions, and a growing sense of community partnership. Julian's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text message from his wife. "Sarah, don't forget to come home, hero. Lasagna's waiting." He smiled, the familiar warmth of her words grounding him. Sarah had been his rock through the storm, her unwavering support a constant reminder of why he fought so hard every day. With a renewed sense of purpose, Julian headed to his car and drove home. The next morning, Julian arrived at City Hall for a meeting with Mayor Evelyn Grant and the City Council. It was a follow-up to the unveiling of the Community Accountability Program, a chance to discuss progress and plan next steps. As he entered the chamber, the mood was markedly different from the tense and skeptical meetings he'd attended months ago. The council members greeted him with nods of respect, and Mayor Grant stood to shake his hand. "Chief Carter," she said with a smile, "it's good to see you. I've heard nothing but praise for the changes you've implemented. The numbers speak for themselves." Julian took his seat at the head of the table, his tone measured but optimistic. "Thank you, Madam Mayor. The progress is encouraging, but there's still more to be done. Rebuilding trust takes time, and we can't let up." Councilman Rivera, a vocal advocate for police reform, leaned forward. "Chief, I think I speak for everyone here when I say that your leadership has been transformative. Other cities are looking to Ashtonville as a model. How do you plan to maintain this momentum?" Julian paused, considering his words. "By staying consistent. The moment we let complacency creep in, we risk losing everything we've built. That means continued training, community engagement, and accountability. At every level." The council members nodded in agreement, and the discussion shifted to long-term funding and expansion of the programs Julian had implemented. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the city was committed to sustaining the progress they had made together. As Julian left City Hall, he noticed a small group of protesters gathered on the steps. Their signs called for justice, transparency, and reform, echoing the very ideals Julian had fought to uphold. He approached them, his presence drawing curious glances. One of the protesters, a young woman with a determined expression, stepped forward. "Chief Carter," she said, her voice steady but cautious, "we've heard about the changes you've made, but we're here to make sure they don't stop. Too often, promises are made, and then things go back to the way they were." Julian nodded, his expression earnest. "I hear you, and I understand your concerns. That's why I've worked to ensure these changes are institutionalized, so they can't be undone by a single person or administration. But change doesn't just happen in the precinct. It happens here, with people like you holding us accountable. Keep doing what you're doing. It makes a difference." The woman studied him for a moment, then extended her hand. Julian shook it, feeling a sense of mutual respect. As he walked away, he couldn't help but feel that the real victory was in moments like this, bridging the gap between the community and the department. Months turned into a year, and the transformation of the Ashtonville Police Department became a national story. Julian was invited to speak at conferences, share his insights, and consult with other cities looking to implement similar reforms. But despite the growing recognition, he remained focused on the community he served. One afternoon, as Julian was reviewing files in his office, Claire knocked on the door. "Chief, there's someone here to see you," she said, her tone unusually soft. "Who is it?" Julian asked, glancing up. "It's the young man from the town hall a while back, the one who thanked you for the changes. He's here with his brother." Julian's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "Send them in." The door opened, and the young man entered with his brother, a tall, quiet figure who carried himself with a mix of nervousness and gratitude. Julian stood, extending his hand. "Good to see you again," he said, shaking the young man's hand. He turned to the brother. "And it's good to meet you." The brother hesitated, then spoke. "Chief Carter, I just wanted to say thank you. A year ago, I wouldn't have set foot in this building. But what you've done, it's changed things. People feel like they can breathe again, like we're finally being heard." Julian smiled, his voice steady. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know." The two men left, and Julian sat back down, a rare moment of emotion crossing his face. It wasn't often that he allowed himself to feel the impact of his work, But moments like this reminded him that every late night, every difficult decision, was worth it. As the years passed, Julian's legacy grew. The Ashtonville Police Department became a beacon of reform, proof that change was possible when leadership, community, and determination came together. Julian eventually retired, leaving behind a department that was stronger, fairer, and more accountable than the one he had inherited. On his last day, officers and community members gathered to celebrate his service. As Julian addressed the crowd, his voice carried the same quiet strength that had guided him through his tenure. "This isn't the end," he said. "Change doesn't stop because one person steps down. It's a collective effort, and it's something we must fight for every day. The work we've done together is just the beginning. And I know this community, our community, will continue to lead the way." The applause that followed was deafening, but Julian's heart was calm. He had done what he set out to do, and now it was time to let others carry the torch. That night, as Julian sat on his porch with Sarah, the city stretched out before them. He felt a deep sense of peace. The fight had been long and hard, but it was worth it. Ashtonville was stronger, and so was he. Together, they had proven that change wasn't just a dream, it was a reality.